How does thought leadership help us make better decisions? After all, thought leadership isn't just an intellectual pursuit. We're trying to put ideas and insights to use for ourselves as well as the people we serve. My guest today is Thomas Lahnthaler. He's the CEO of Crisis Compass, who focuses on helping organizations navigate through crisis and make decisions more effectively. In his past, he's done work in conflict management, risk management, and disaster management. I'm eager to talk with Thomas today about using thought leadership, ideas, and insights to make better decisions before the crisis occurs. I'm Bill Sherman, and you're listening to Leveraging Thought Leadership. Ready? Let's begin. Welcome to the show, Thomas.
Thanks, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here.
I want to explore a little bit the concept of risk and thought leadership with you. And I know you spend your time thinking about risk from the crisis point of view when you're in the moment of the crucible. So maybe we start there and then build out to thought leadership. When you think about risk and decisioning in moments of crisis, how are you thinking about it?
Well, that's an excellent entry point for any conversation, if you ask me, because of course that's my background. I look upon crisis as a point in time where, for example, decisions are inevitable. So you have to make decisions because you're at a point where it might be a crossroads, it might be a situation that you maneuvered yourself in or didn't react previously that led up to this point. Risk, however, in this particular moment is for me something that I'd like mentally, and that's also when I work with companies and with other leaders, to eliminate. Because what's beyond the decision is naturally for me something you don't know. And particularly in complex systems like we are navigating these days, the complexity that we have to navigate, it's not possible to know what's beyond it. So technically everything is a risk. And this is a little bit what also will probably link us to thought leadership later on. I think it's about really stepping up and accepting that you have to make decisions, not delaying them, but looking at what are my choices. And here is where I like to navigate with my own experience and with the managers and leaders that I work with, is to help them create their own options. In addition to natural choices that we have in every crisis situations, it's really about creating your own options based on your resources, because that's where you keep control. That's where you can actually minimize at least the feeling of risk and the feeling of uncertainty, because you have the feeling that you create something, you have the feeling you come up with something that's yours, and you can influence whatever you're going to decide. So this is kind of my entry point and my perspective.
So let's build on that feeling of risk. And you talked about the need to make a decision. And I think as we get into thought leadership is not just the intellectual, hey, let's think big thoughts and not do anything. Thought leadership is about taking ideas into the present to take action. So let's stay in your world for a moment. I want to ask you about that feeling of risk and the need for action. Can you give a story or an example of that really brings that crystallized?
What I have experienced many times is that if you're faced with the options that you have in a crisis, let's say, for example, a simple situation is, do I have to fire many people or not? Because I'm in a crisis situation where we don't get enough money. We're not sure, like it was in the COVID pandemic now, or still probably for a couple of companies around the world, that they're in a situation where they might not have enough business. So the question is, what am I going to do? Do I let staff go? Do I change my business model completely? And all of these are risky choices. Some of them might naturally be presented through the situation. So yeah, you might not have enough money to pay all your staff. So you have to maybe think differently anyway. But here it's for me about not thinking about the risk, because I observe very, very often that management teams, crisis management teams, think about the outcomes of their potential decisions. And while that's a fair thought, it's primarily assumption-based. And assumptions, in my experience, contribute a lot to an increased feeling of risk. You have to be comfortable with your assumption in order to feel less of a risk. And that is a tricky thing, because it's misleading. Our assumptions do not come from nowhere. Our assumptions come from our own experiences, from biases we have, from perspectives that we're presented, and they're limited. So I'm trying to maneuver that thinking away from what could potentially happen afterwards, because that we will only find out once we've made a choice. But I want to actually focus on the scope of influence of managers. So taking us back to the example, let's say so what do we have available? Like what resources do we actually have? Because I've also noticed that many companies are not even aware of a fraction of the resources that they have at their disposal. And here I'm not only speaking about money, not speaking about time, assets, I'm also speaking about competencies, experience, knowledge, connections, all those things. And they can contribute to you making your own choices and maybe feel more comfortable, more confident in your decisions, and consequently feel less of a risk feeling.
So one of the things that I know when I experience a moment of fear is that I get a sense of tunnel vision. The world shrinks and I only see what's immediately ahead of me. And I think that's true, like you said, in our ability to sense the resources that are just on the periphery of our vision. We forget about what's available. And so one of the things in terms of behavior is either remembering those things in the moment or moving that sort of decision-making process earlier so that you're not in a moment of fear and you're not in tunnel vision.
Absolutely. And what contributes to often this crisis feeling, and that's so interesting what you just say, because it's very much in line with what I experience when I work with my clients. It's this sense of urgency. And the sense of urgency is very often actually a sense that comes out of this crisis narrative. It comes out of a feeling like you are basically in a corner. Now you have to act. And if you had acted previously, yes, you would probably not be in a corner. Crisis management experts and consultants around the world call this avoided or averted crisis. I think they're not necessarily avoided. It was just you acted upon it earlier. A crisis is then really the moment when you basically okay, now I don't have now the option of not doing anything anymore is not really there. It would also be a choice that I make, but I still have to I feel I have to do something. And the tunnel vision that you describe is a very common phenomenon. I think that's also an advantage in many situations. However, what I have made as a habit and what I try to really promote as a habit is really this exchanging perspectives, because even if we all have a tunnel vision, we look at things differently. So if the two of us, for example, would be in a crisis situation and we both have a tunnel vision, it doesn't mean we see the same things. So if we start to exchange what we actually see, what we perceive, what we think about the situation, we're already naturally expanding that tunnel. So the exchange of perspectives, the different views on things, and really this questioning, like what do we know, what do we assume? And maybe to clarify, I'm not against working with assumptions. I just really think it's important to make it explicit if we work with assumptions. Because it's natural. I mean, we have to work with assumptions at one or the other point, but you have to know that this is an assumption. It's not something you know, because I've seen that companies often fall in that trap where they assume they, for example, have access to a resource or that something is available to them, and it's not, because it's outside their scope of influence, and they fell in the trap because they made it part of their plans, for example. So exchanging perspectives and identifying assumptions would be two habits that I really would highly recommend in these situations.
And so that leads to, if we shift the decision point, and I like that language that you used of shift it earlier, you're still making decision. You've still got a moment of crisis. Do we do A or B? It's information seeking beforehand and then making the informed, aware decision with a broader field of view. And I think this is a beautiful sort of place where we can start weaving thought leadership into it. Because one of the ways that I look at thought leadership is you look around the corner into the future, you see what is possible, either as a risk or opportunity, and then say, if that's true, who needs to know about it? And what do we need to do today? Right. And so it's not that you're eliminating the crisis. You're not eliminating the decision point. You're preparing for it.
That's a wonderful way of putting it, because it's really the preparing for these decision points, because they will come. They're a natural part of our development. And I keep trying to point out that we're constantly developing. So this is not a process. Change is not something that needs to be put on a podium, so to say, and like, oh, now we're changing constantly. But a crisis is just a moment that's perceived as an extreme change because the stakes are a lot higher. So if you prepare for those situations, if you as a thought leader have on the screen that you have to think maybe a couple of steps ahead, you try out different ways of working before they are necessary. So one way I try to work with this is what I call, well, in an innovative way, is to set up these teams that potentially could manage crises, but make them innovation teams rather than crisis management teams. It's just a different way of putting it because the work is the same. They will have to come up with solutions and ideas for critical situations. But if you do that when you're not in a critical situation, you have the exact same outcome with less stakes and less pressure. So it's just a way of simply habitually working around the crisis. And I really like that way of preparing for it, preparing for the decision point, because that's possible. But maybe you can build on that with your experience. What I've seen a lot of times happening is that people have ideas, and in crisis that might be even more extreme than in other situations. But because the stakes are so high, because the pressure is so high, managers or leaders, for me that's not necessarily the same in a crisis situation, have troubles of letting go of their idea. Mm-hmm. And in particular in crisis situations, that's actually might be an advantage. So if you have ideas, or if you have a situation and say like, so here's my idea, you develop it further and bring it back to me so that I can make a decision as unbiased as I can be. Because and you have other eyes, other perspectives on your idea, and maybe they build forward and you get it back, maybe with a little bit of a different face, but it's still your idea at the core of it. I don't know if you have experienced this, but I have seen that thought leaders, when they do this, it's in a way a relief. They get really excited about what they get back, and they actually feel they have way more engagement. It's not so lonely at the top as I sometimes hear, really literally that statement. It's this, oh, what, we're in this together. I'm not alone. And that actually is empowering at the end of it.
So I love several things that you said there. Going back to the difference between crisis management and then innovation teams, right? And so I thought of the distinction between firefighting and fire prevention. At the end of the day, you don't want the building on fire. There are several ways of getting there, right? And so if you socialize an idea and you tell people, oh, it's a good idea to change your smoke detector batteries, and you talk about, yeah, maybe cut the brush back away from your house so that a wildfire doesn't happen, you can then seek out other ideas as to how do we make this happen. And when you try to hold on to an idea too tightly, you limit the good ideas that can come from it. And you also limit the ability for other people to take ownership. And what I like about what you're talking about there is the willingness to put an idea out, to share it and say, run with it, bring it back to me. Let's see where it grows. The key for me is ideas grow rather than remain static. If you hold on to an idea and it stays static for too long, that's the dangerous assumption that you were talking about, right? That is the thing that is no longer true.
This is exactly what I experience in crisis situations. It's the misplaced ownership and almost pride that, I have the feeling responsibility that is very often on the top of companies. It's really centralized there. And I get it. You have the overall responsibility for your company. It's just fair. But that doesn't mean you have to do everything. It's also impossible to do everything. You still, at the end of the day, have to run your business. So you cannot firefight, run the business, drive the fire truck and all at the same time. You have to let go of some of those things. And the sooner you're able to do this, the more you make it a habit within your company. And it will disrupt less when a crisis comes. Because not often a crisis doesn't affect companies the same way. Let's take COVID, right? This was a contextual crisis in many ways, but it had different effects on different types of businesses. Different sectors experienced this very, very differently. So the key here is really to look at it more holistically, more inclusive, and as you say, prepare earlier for it.
If you are enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about the podcast, please leave a 5-star review and share it with your friends. We are available on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and all major platforms, as well as at leveragingthoughtleadership.com. I want to turn to a story that I know about for you, where regardless of the amount of preparation, things hit you by surprise. And so you applied for a program. And I would love for you to tell that story of how what you thought you were signing up for, it didn't turn out the way that was expected.
No, it actually didn't turn out the way it was expected at all. It was really the low point in my life, so to say, because I was very disillusioned. I came out of a very complex working environment. I used to work in the humanitarian sphere with crisis and conflict management, and came out of Afghanistan at that point. So I was really at a motivational low. So I started looking and applied for this program that you mentioned, and it was called a Traditional Mediation and Leadership Program. Something I thought, well, I'm a trained mediator. That's interesting. Traditional. I've worked with Indigenous people a bit before because it was run by the Aborigines in Australia. So I applied for this, being on the other side of the world, and I sent my application. Now, as a background, I'm from Austria. And I keep saying, like, I don't know why these two terms are so similar, Austria and Australia in English. I still haven't gotten to the core of that. What happened was when I came there, they accepted me. And when I came there, it turns out that they were as surprised as I was that I showed up because they thought I was Australian. And then it turns out that they haven't read my application properly, because otherwise I wouldn't have been accepted, because I was the only non-Australian there. Well, it turned out to be a life-changing experience for me, because I really thought it was going to be a training, as, let's say, in the West anyway, or in the Northern Hemisphere, we would probably expect a training to be. You would get introduced to different concepts and to ideas, and in many ways, we were introduced to that, but in a very different way. So I was given only one rule, as all my other colleagues who were there guests, and this rule was, you're not allowed to ask any questions. And of course, I didn't take this particularly seriously, but they did. So the Aboriginal community, they really didn't answer any questions. So every time we put a question forward, they would say, no questions, observe, listen, learn. And this was highly frustrating. It was very, very difficult, because you're so desperate on understanding concepts that you couldn't grasp. You're desperate to get insights into their thinking, into their worldviews. You have this unique opportunity in this beautiful island north of Australia. Nobody would answer the million of questions that you and all the others had. So we were highly frustrated after about 3 days. But then, and this is kind of where the turning point happened. You're so desperate that there's no place to look other than yourself. And this is when the magic happens, because I realized I'd never thought my whole life before about concepts like leadership. What does this actually mean to you? I have studied leadership theories. I've heard people talk about it, but I have not made my own opinion, my mind up. What does it mean for me? What is actually leadership? What does it contain? What does it consist of? And so on. And this process was true for a couple of concepts. And what it did is it just really empowered me. And it has also inspired my work since, because it is about this, well, self-clarification, self-reflection, and understanding where you come from before you share your ideas, because then you can even more confidently put them forward and actually explain, well, how did you get this idea, where it's rooted, and be more open for input. Because what I have realized is, since I was clear about my own understanding of things, when others saw things differently, I didn't take that personally. It's just, that's their opinion. We actually exchanged what we have in common, what we see differently, how we perceive certain concepts, and how we came to these conclusions. And every conversation became more enriching, because I had my own foundation. And that doesn't mean I didn't change that or that didn't evolve over the years, but I knew where I was coming from. So it's really this self-clarification that just made a difference. And also this concept of not asking immediately, but before you ask, actually reflect, how would I answer the question? And that's kind of a tip that I always give people, like, reflect first how you would answer the question before you ask it. Because then you actually know, then you have something to talk about and are not only receiving information that might or might not feel disempowering.
So I like the concept here in terms of know where you stand first before jumping into that moment of crisis, right? Because if you're in that moment of crisis where you need to make a decision, then all of the knowledge or book learning in the world or insights from other people winds up being a wind that's blowing you one way or the other. If you have no framework to make that decision, it becomes very difficult.
This is exactly what I've experienced myself, having managed many crises over the years. This is really what I had to also learn the hard way. I think it's important, and this is why I always get back to these decisions, because this is kind of the common denominator in crisis. And the thing is, for me, it's all about the confidence, and the confidence starts with exactly what you just said. It's this: I know where I come from. I know how I came to this choice that I made at the end of the day, and I know why I made it. And for me, it's always this, like, in a couple of years, you still have to look back, despite the outcome. So for me, I'm not judging decisions based on their outcome. I'm actually judging decisions based on how they were made, because the outcome for me is per default often an unknown in crisis situations. So for me, there's also a mismatch between this was a bad decision just because the outcome wasn't as I desired. Didn't make the decision necessarily bad, made the outcome bad, but not the decision. And that simple mindset is key, because for me, that is the key to look back and say, like, 10 years ago, I made that choice and it was an incredibly difficult one. I know I made it. I stand by it. The outcome was not at all what I hoped for, but I knew why I took the decision, so I can stand by it. For me, it's always, you hear often, whether it's politicians or others, saying, like, if I had known back then what I know now, I would have made a different choice. Yes, for me, that goes without saying. That's clear, but it's not the same decision that you would have made either way. So this is that's why really self-clarification is crucial for leaders before they get into crisis situations.
So you mentioned something as a mediator that I want to touch on a little bit more. In moments of crisis, being able to see the world through someone else's eyes, the other person who's in the situation with you. We could call that empathy. You might use different terms as well. But that ability to shift perspective, I think, is a tool that is useful and incredibly useful for people who practice thought leadership, because the people who practice thought leadership spend a lot of time developing specialty knowledge and expertise around one area. And they forget that the people that they're working with, who are just coming to this the first time, don't know much, if anything, about the topic. And so how do you come in a way where you understand what it is to have beginner's mind again, and approach with a bit of humility to be able to say, this is what I've seen, this is what I know, but I don't know your perspective. So talk to me about that sense of empathy in the moment of crisis and decision. How do you see the world from others' perspectives?
I think you have to let go. That's, for me, that's the first thing that comes to mind, because it's letting go of, I have to fix it all. And especially if you're in a leadership or manager role, and I keep saying both, because maybe to just quickly dive into that, crisis managers can be leaders for me, but they don't have to. And because crisis management is just simply, it's a task. Often these two are, however, in the communication, they're used interchangeably, and I'm very critical of this, because I've seen crisis leaders, or leaders in crisis, this is how I actually would prefer to say it, pop up out of nowhere. It's this stand-up leadership. And if you, as a manager, for example, let go of the responsibility that I have to fix it all, and there might be in this particular phase others who are more ready to lead into this unknown situation that's coming ahead, doesn't mean I can't take the decision at the end of the day. But they might be having a function that is a leadership function in this particular role. And if you let go of that ownership, you're already letting go of things that you can take personal. And that brings me back to your question. So for me, I accept that my perspective is just one perspective of many. This is the acceptance, the letting go of, I have to know it all. I have to have the answer to everything. That what I often hear, that people are like, but I'm losing my face if I'm not having the answer to this. No, I've never in my whole life experienced that it was taken negatively when I said, like, you know what? I don't know. I would like to hear your thoughts on this. I don't know it all. I have my ideas, but please share. It's also this, the way that I show this to managers is just it should take something that's very valuable to them and just throw it out there and say, like, so what do you think about it? And try to not react, not justify, not explain, just simply listen to what other people have to say. And this is very difficult, but I've learned you can practice this. And once you have let go of the emotional state and get through it and accept, okay, this might be hurtful to hear, you're very, very much more open to other inputs. And actually, wow, that's a perspective. I never looked at that way. And once you have discovered how beautiful it is, that you get different perspectives on your idea and how much bigger, like what you said before, the ideas grow, how much bigger they get through that. I think you can't get enough. At least I can't get enough. And I know you can't get enough either by all the thought leadership ideas that you put out there and the perspectives that you're keen on seeking from other people. So it's a beautiful thing. And it comes with letting go. It comes with accepting that your perspective is just one of many and a sense of curiosity.
So if I were to pull that sense of letting go is for leaders the ability to recognize that there will be many decisions and many conversations that will happen that will be outside of the rooms that they're in. So you may have the salesperson talking to a customer about the future. And one of two things, you can either script that out for them line by line or word by word, or you can prepare them, just like you talked about flipping the conversation between firefighting and innovation, right? So how do you prepare all of the people in your organization to have smart conversations appropriate to what they know and the world they see, not only internally with their colleagues, but also externally to the world beyond? Because each of us sees a piece of a puzzle, but we don't always see the whole puzzle.
I think for me, it's about practicing this behavior first on the inside. It's this, if you want to call it innovation or reinvention teams or whatever name you want to give it. I encourage companies to make this a habit, to have as diverse teams, and by diversity I mean literally diversity, not only race, gender, and the more obvious aspects, but also experience, old, new, indie organizations. So how long have you actually worked in this company? So really put together different teams and make almost like innovation projects. And in these innovation projects, make a couple of habits that this team should apply. One of them is exchanging perspectives. Another one is make space for emotions. Incredibly important, because emotions are often, when we talk about crisis, it's about rationalizing it. I've experienced the absolute opposite. If you're not dealing with emotions, if you're not making space for them, they'll come back. There's no doubt about it. And they come back at the most inconvenient moment. I can guarantee you that. And then you're not able to deal with them because you don't know where they come from. They're more intense. They're not as easily controllable, and so on. So you have a couple of habits, right? Also looking into other sectors for getting new ideas. It's a beautiful thing. Like, look outside your little walls and get new inspiration. So if you have these teams, practice this for a couple of weeks, come up with an idea, might help the company, but it might certainly build a bit of culture. And if you do this the same way throughout the companies and different compositions, you might develop a culture of doing exactly that, being able to share perspective and accept other perspectives, for example. And then you're ready to also naturally do this to the outside, because they will be promoting, just like I did on the island. I experienced this, and many other people who were there experienced a similar phenomena like me, that you all of a sudden shared more than you tried to convince or that you tried to discuss. It became really an experience of exchanging perspectives and building on each other. And if you have developed that habit in a company, and that's a cultural thing, then you might be able also to spread that beyond your company borders.
Well, and the better that you get for having those skills for teams to spot risks and opportunities, the better you are for spotting opportunities for thought leadership as well. You see around the corner and you know what you need to do today.
Absolutely. And I think one final point to add to this, it's not always about agreeing. I think I've seen so many times in companies like, well, we all have to agree and we all have to see it the same way. No, it's a superpower to not see it the same way, because you actually have way more diversity. You become flexible. You become adaptable. You're way better prepared for whether it's crisis or simply moving forward, making space for thought leadership ideas, because it's about seeing things differently. It's about trying new things. You don't have to always agree on those things.
And that leads us to building resilience and flexibility rather than rigidity, assumptions, and brittleness into the organization. And I think that's a great place to wind up our conversation. There's so much more we could talk about, but thank you for joining us today, Thomas.
Thanks a lot, Bill. It was really great to talk to you.
If you're interested in organizational thought leadership, then I invite you to subscribe to the OrgTL newsletter. Each month, we talk about the people who create, curate, and deploy thought leadership on behalf of their organizations. Go to the website orgtl.com and choose Join Our Newsletter. I'll leave a link to the website as well as my LinkedIn profile in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing what you thought of the show.